Hello, everyone, and welcome back for another episode of the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast, where we celebrate individuals and families, businesses, and organizations that seek out and promote the exploration, stewardship, conservation, access, and enjoyment of the outdoors. Gulf Shores and Orange Beach Tourism is the sponsor of our episode today. Warm temps and fresh seafood make the Alabama Gulf Coast the perfect beach destination for your family vacation, couples getaway, outdoor adventure, meetings, conferences, and conventions. Our guest today is Anthony Ricciardone. Anthony is the co-owner of Admiral Shellfish Company based out of Fort Morgan, Alabama. Admiral raises and harvests prime oysters grown in South Alabama. Anthony, it's a pleasure to have you on the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. Welcome.
Thanks, man. Good afternoon. Appreciate you talking about some delicious Alabama seafood with us.
Oh my God, let me tell you, when Easton Colvin from Gulf Shores and Orange Beach Tourism said, Howard, I got one lined up for you. How do you feel about oysters? And I'm like, oh my God, this man is going to be making my mouth water because I love oysters.
They're good friends of the farm. We love having them out.
Fantastic. Now, asking for a friend, do you ship oysters throughout the country? Or you pretty much just stay local?
We don't yet. It's part of our long-term, like one of our long-term business model revenue streams we want to add. Right now in Alabama, we have just as strict or stricter health regulations as anybody in the US, which probably isn't something most people out of state associate with Alabama, but we are on the cutting edge of like time to chill the oysters, harvest restrictions. Right now, they don't really let farms like me ship direct to consumers. We'd have to set up our own oyster processor and a bunch of other technical things, but not yet, but they are available down in the Southeast locally. And we sell from everywhere to Houston, New Orleans, up to Nashville, over to Atlanta, back down to the coast. There's plenty of places to get out of oysters besides us shipping them to you right now.
All right. I love that. So Las Vegas is out. I get that. And I guess this means I'm going to have to come down to Gulf Shores and enjoy some oysters.
Do it, brother.
Fantastic. Well, in celebration of this project with Gulf Shores and Orange Beach Tourism, what I would love to know first is a little bit more information about you. How did you get into oyster farming?
Yeah, it years ago, I live on the bay about 14 miles from where the oyster farm is today.
Okay.
And Auburn University does a great job of oyster gardening down here in collaboration with NOAA and Sea Grant and a bunch of extension agents. They do this everywhere from New York City to Chesapeake Bay, places in Louisiana and Mississippi. But basically, they give homeowners a certain amount of spat baby oysters fixed to a shell, and you grow them up. And between, say, hundreds of homeowners, that's enough to replenish a reef kind of year to year. And just getting more interested in that, I just started realizing that there's a lot of new aquaculture technology out there. For the last 15 or 20 years, there's kind of been a renaissance on farmed oysters versus harvesting wild oysters. Just kind of started reading more about it and just fell backwards into it, and still kind of keep a day job with some pharmaceuticals, but most of the time's at the farm, and you just kind of fall in love with working on the water and all that kind of stuff eventually. So just one thing led to another. Be careful if you get involved in oyster gardening, might turn into a farmer.
Sometimes I do wish I had another career. Well, I love my career as a podcaster and as a coach.
Right.
The career before that is where I could have used you. It's like, oyster farming, that's kind of interesting. You said something just a few minutes ago, and I have to ask the question, Eagle or Roll Tide?
Right, War Eagle.
All right, War Eagle. All right. When I moved to Montgomery, Alabama, so by the way, I do have a little bit of credibility. I lived in Montgomery for a year.
That counts.
Yes. When I came into the office the first time, the account manager didn't say, "Hey, Howard, nice to meet you." She asked me the question, who's allegiance to? And I said, whoever you want it to be.
That's a convenient way to answer. I mean, obviously Bama, Saban have been pretty dominant last decade or so, but Auburn's had their wins as well. That's all I'm going to say about that.
There you go. There you go. So I'm curious, how has wild oysters, and I imagine they've been harvested for a long time, because once we realize, well, we can eat these mollusks, do I have that name right?
You do. Mollusks, they're bivalves within the mollusk occasion.
Okay. When did the commercial view of raising oysters. When did that start to kind of take hold?
Even in going back to the first written history around here in millennia before native peoples, people have always been harvesting oysters. And
Okay.
there's some really good books out there, not to shout out anyone at anyone else's expense, but like The Big Oyster, kind of about the New York City and the Blue Point area harvesting. Over time, obviously, we started depleting the natural reefs, and people realized that to go back and enhance those reefs, kind of the first beginnings of aquaculture, even in colonial, maybe early 19th century, 1800 times, people knew that, hey, we collect spat, like these larvae when oyster breed that get in the water and a little baby oyster will cement onto something and grow into a seed that we call oyster spat. People started really getting behind, let's go to the places where there's lots of these baby oysters and replenish reefs elsewhere so we can keep a commercial harvest going on. And whether they knew it or not, that was kind of the beginnings of aquaculture in the 1900s and certainly the early 2000s. You really everywhere from Prince Edward Island, Canada, all the way down to where Auburn University, kind of the Dr. Walton and some of his efforts in the early 2000s down here started training, whether it's fishermen or just people on the working waterfront or oystermen, that, hey, you can commercially buy spat, just use top water floating baskets like we have at our farm, kind of behind me in the video, where we can, instead of relying on what we find in the water, we can plant a certain amount of oysters, use techniques, same way that Wagyu beef uses certain husbandry techniques on that beef to make a really premium product.
Mhm.
We can develop our own practices and modify the oyster as opposed to just going out and fishing for it. And that's what we focus on today at Admiral Shellfish.
Okay. Now, when I was visiting the Admiral Shellfish company's website, and I did do a little bit of homework beforehand, you market yourselves as a premium purveyor of oysters.
Yes, sir.
So, question: what does a premium oyster look like?
Great question. And I've actually got one right here. It's the simplest way to explain it, probably not going to be great on video. The simplest way to explain it is a
Okay.
predictably deep cup and a
Okay.
flat top.
Okay.
Why is that important? It's easy to shuck and it plates in a really desirable way. The oyster meat itself is floating in what we call the liquor, or I hate
Right.
to use juice, it's kind of a nasty term, but like the natural liquid that the oyster has.
Right.
When you plate the oyster, you want to maintain that. There's a lot of really good proteins and salinity and things that affect our palate inside of that. So if you have a deep cup, the table presentation is easy. And if you're a chef, if you're spending money at a restaurant and charging a premium price, you don't want 6 or 10 different size oysters across a dozen.
Right.
You want the oysters to be shapely and similar across that order. And we use about a half a dozen different techniques at the farm to get these deep cups. So it's easy to shuck and it plays really well. That's the main difference between a wild oyster, which is a little less or a lot less predictable on what kind of shape and size you're going to get.
Okay. Okay. Now, with oyster farming, especially in southern Alabama, the Gulf of Mexico, you have a lot of instances where we have done some not so good things to the
Yes, sir.
environment, to the water. Now we have climate change
Yes, sir.
doing its thing. What are some of the obstacles folks like yourself at Admiral Shellfish or some of your competitors, what are you all doing to prevent or minimize the effects of some of these obstacles that are coming your way?
Great question. I'll try not to be too long winded, but I mean, if you
Okay.
look back, the Nature Conservation, the Nature Conservancy has a really good article out there about how maybe 80 or 90% of our natural reefs on the Gulf Coast and elsewhere have been depleted. And so the wild harvest has to be managed very carefully now because just the numbers aren't there. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, there's been the deep water horizon was largely an offshore event. Oysters are grown in the bay and in the estuary, but of course that wasn't a great time. Damming up rivers, the way erosion and siltation happens in the bays, the dying of seagrasses, wave energy from ship traffic, all the way to things you said about climate change. And we're in a pristine area. We don't have any development within dozens of miles of us, but if a sewage treatment plant popped up near an oyster farm, which is not a problem we have, but that wouldn't be a good thing, obviously. But there's a
Mhm.
lot of towns on the Gulf Coast. So those are kind of the headwinds for the national environment. We get to take a lot of that off the table. We chose the most pristine area left on the Alabama coast. We're right down this peninsula called the Fort Morgan Peninsula to the
Mhm.
west. If you're looking at a map, to the left of Gulf Shores by about 20 miles. It's very sparsely populated. And due to some historical things like the Battle of Mobile Bay and the existence of the Fort Oregon structure itself, the whole area is basically protected, and we're not near a lot of commercial shipping traffic. So we've got this pristine bay water meeting the Gulf of Mexico, 1,000 yards next to our farm, where we're getting a good, clean tidal flush every day. We've got a nice, shallow, sandy bottom, so the water doesn't have a lot of turbidity and sediment in it and things
Mhm.
like that. And beyond that, if you, like the image behind me, we're growing our oysters on the top of the water column. We don't get the predation and the low oxygen that exists if we were growing them in the bottoms of deeper, muddier waters. And further, oysters eat plankton, phytoplankton, which are things that use the sun to grow, and zooplankton, which are very small animals that the oysters filter out and eat. The top of the water column is a great place for our oysters to catch those things. So they're real happy because they get to eat. They get a lot of wave energy, which chips them up, causing that deeper cup.
Mhm.
And every week or two, we're flipping these cages over so the oysters are sitting in the sun and we're that close to the sunlight on the top. So we can use that to burn off things like algae and barnacles. So that when a chef orders a case of these things, yeah, of course they go through a processor, but they get a nice clean shell without fouling and stinky stuff like algae clinging onto the shell. So
Okay.
we kind of took the best things that oysters evolved and what they wanted and just gave it to them in the most concentrated way using some of these aquaculture technologies that we have available to us today.